Hello everyone. Please make yourself comfortable and relax. I have plenty of stories to tell you tonight. And it begins like this. Once upon a time, in the empire of Persia, there was a king called Shahryar. His land extended as far east as India and China, and his name alone made lesser monarchs tremble. But even though no army or country could resist his power, Shahryar had failed to conquer the heart of his first wife. She had betrayed him with another man. And this had made him believe that all women would betray him in the end. This had made him cold and cruel. And so, to take his revenge on all women, he married a new one each night, only to have her executed the next morning, so she could never be unfaithful. For 3 years this lasted, and hundreds of young women lost their lives to the king's murderous madness. Noble parents in Persia lived in terror that their daughter would be chosen to become a queen for one night. The king's vizier found a new noble virgin each day, but eventually few were left, and soon would come the turn of one of the most exquisite beauties in Persia, his own daughter, Scheherazade. Scheherazade was not only beautiful, polite, and pleasant. She had studied philosophy, the sciences, and art. She had also collected 1,000 books of stories and histories about ancient kings, legends, long-gone thinkers, and she was so passionate about knowledge that she knew all of them by heart. She was witty and wise, and her father, the vizier, treasured her like no other person in the world. And so he trembled, because the turn of Scheherazade to marry Shahryar was coming. To his surprise, she came to find him one day and volunteered to marry the king. This, in his view, could not mean anything else than a death sentence. Scheherazade loved life, and had resolved to not only save herself, but all other women who would continue to die because of Shahryar's absurd revenge, if nothing was done. And so she had elaborated a plan. As she had requested, she was married to the king, and that night she was brought to the king's chamber to spend her last night with him. Instead of crying and supplicating like her predecessors, she offered the king, instead of telling him the story she had prepared for her younger sister. Shahryar accepted, and so she began telling a story so fascinating, exciting, and detailed that hours passed quickly as the king listened with awe, and then she stopped in the middle. The king asked her to finish the story, but Scheherazade said there was no time, as dawn was breaking. And this was right. The king looked outside, and the first rays of the sun were about to appear. The night had passed. there was no way he would let her die without knowing the end of the story. And for that reason, he decided to spare her life, only for one day, so she could finish her story the following night. The following night, Scheherazade concluded her story, and then began a second tale, even more exciting and suspenseful than the first one. And again, she stopped the tale halfway at dawn. Another time, the king spared her life to listen to the end of the second story. And to the surprise of everyone in the palace, the queen survived for another day. A new life began for Shahryar. Each day, he eagerly anticipated the conclusion of the previous night's story, and he kept Scheherazade alive, as she made him live in a world of wonders, adventures, love, and heroism. This lasted for 1001 nights, during which Scheherazade told 1,000 stories. During these 1001 nights, Scheherazade and the king had 3 sons. But after 1,000 stories, the queen had none left to tell, and she asked Shahryar to be able to say goodbye to her 3 sons, as he would certainly decide to have her executed now that she had run out of tales to entertain him. However, the king had fallen in love with her and could no longer imagine living without her presence, and so he spared her life for good. The witty and wise Scheherazade had triumphed. Tonight, we are going to relive some of the stories Scheherazade told the king along these 1001 nights. Well-known stories like Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, Aladdin and the Magic Lamp, or Sinbad the Sailor, or lesser-known tales. The stories are all folk tales and legends from the Arab and Persian worlds that were compiled and rewritten over the centuries, often under the Arabic title Alf Layla wa Layla, 1001 Nights, including this framing story with Scheherazade I just told you. 1001 Nights is also known as Arabian Nights in English-speaking countries, because it was the title of a translation published 300 years ago, in the 18th century. I will tell you a little bit about the context, but now is storytelling time, and we are going to continue with the story of Ali Baba. You can use the timestamps to navigate between the stories if you wish. They are in the pinned comment under this video. In the same comment you will also find links to music streaming sites like Spotify or Apple Music, if you prefer to listen to my stories this way. There are more than 100 different one-hour stories on each of these services. You can go to my artist page and check the whole list of albums. And there is also a link to my Patreon page in this pinned comment. Patreon is what keeps this channel free of ads, and I try to keep commercial pressure to a minimum on this channel. I usually don't sponsor brands or try to sell you anything, but I still need funding, and this is where you can contribute to it if you wish. You also get downloads, advanced releases, and regular news about upcoming stories. But for now, take a deep breath. There is probably tension left in your shoulders that you can let go of. And let's dive into the story of Ali Baba. Once upon a time, there was a merchant who had 2 sons, 2 brothers. The older brother was named Qasim, and the younger Ali Baba. Qasim was ambitious, but also envious and greedy, whereas Ali Baba was the opposite, simple, kind, and easy to get along with. This certainly made Ali Baba the happier of the 2. He was satisfied with whatever life gave him. He never forgot to admire the beauty of the world and to feel grateful for anything he received. Whereas Qasim was generally unsatisfied and could not stop thinking about what he didn't have. After their father's death, Qasim put his hands on all the inheritance and went on to marry a rich wife, which made him well-to-do. Ali Baba married a poor woman out of love and settled into the trade of a woodcutter. All days, Ali Baba went to the forest to cut and collect firewood. In the forest, he generally didn't meet anyone. But one day, he heard voices and hid in a bush, because it was known that sometimes thieves and other outlaws traveled through the forest. A large group was approaching, a group of thieves indeed, but luckily they did not see him. At a distance, he watched them approach a rocky hill in the middle of the forest, and one of them stood in front of a big rock at the hill's foot. He said the words, "Open, Sesame," and a miracle happened. The rock magically moved to the side, revealing the mouth of a cave. The 40 thieves entered the cave, and Ali Baba stayed petrified in his bush, afraid that they could suddenly come out and see him if he moved. The rock came back into place as soon as the last of the 40 thieves had entered the cave. So he waited, but not too long, because soon the 40 thieves went out of the cave with looks of satisfaction on their faces. And again, one of them stood near the entrance and said the words, "Close, Sesame." By magic, the big rock moved again and returned to its initial position, blocking the entrance of the cave, so well that no one could have suspected there was something of interest there. After this, the 40 thieves left the place, and Ali Baba waited for a long time, until the sound of their voices had completely vanished, when only the sounds of birds and wind in the tree leaves could be heard. Then he cautiously moved from his hiding place and came close to the rock, he could not control his curiosity, so he said the words he had overheard. Open sesame. Exactly like before, the rock moved and revealed the entrance of the cave. Ali Baba entered and followed a dark corridor that soon opened on a large underground room. The poor woodcutter could not believe his eyes. Around him were the most sumptuous treasures he had ever seen, that most men had ever seen. Gold coins everywhere, in chests and jars and bags. Gems, gold and silver vessels and vases. Precious silk carpets. Extraordinary furniture. Ali Baba understood that this was the hideout of the 40 thieves, that they had accumulated years of thefts here, and he had seen them as they had come check on their treasure, or as they brought their last booty to the cave. The poor woodcutter took a simple bag of gold coins and decided to return home with it. There was no harm in stealing from thieves, and this was so little in comparison with all that had been accumulated in the cave that no one would notice. But this single bag was more than enough to guarantee him and his wife a happy life. As he walked to the exit, he saw the rock had returned to its position in front of the entrance. So he said the words, "Open, sesame," again. The cave opened, and he could safely return home. When he told the story to his wife and showed her the coins, the two rejoiced. They would live on that gold for years, probably to the end of their lives, and this would make their days even happier. But they needed to weigh the gold, so they asked their sister-in-law, Kasim's wife, if they could borrow her scales. Kasim and his wife liked to laugh at the poverty of Ali Baba and his wife in their bags. They found them adorably humble and naive. So the sister-in-law was curious to know what kind of cheap grain or bad spices they had put their hands on. To satisfy her curiosity, she put a blob of soft wax in the scales. When Ali Baba returned them, she was shocked to find a gold coin that had remained stuck, and immediately told her husband. Kasim was intensely curious about where this gold could have come from. It had not been stolen from him, and there was no way a simple woodcutter could earn such coins. So his brother had probably found a treasure somewhere. He needed to know. He went to Ali Baba and pressured him so much that the poor man was forced to reveal the secret of the cave and how he had found this small bag of gold. Kasim could not believe his brother had been stupid enough to only take a small bag when he could have brought back much more. But he would not make the same mistake. He decided to go to the cave with a donkey, on which he would load as much treasure as possible. Following his brother's instructions, Kasim found the hill in the forest and the rock that blocked the cave's entrance. He said the words, "Open, sesame," and the rock moved. The greedy man entered, saw the treasure as Ali Baba before him, and could not help but jump in joy and sing as he began to load his donkey. However, he was so excited that when he wanted to exit and found the mouth of the cave blocked by the rock, he could not remember the magic words. There was something about a plant or a cereal, but the words just did not come back to him. After hours of crying in rage and banging on the rock that he could not move, he sat in desperation and waited. He could never remember the words "Open Sesame." And what had to happen, happened. After a day and a night spent alone in the cave, he was found there by the 40 thieves, who had once again returned to check on their treasure. They killed him and left his body inside the cave, just near the entrance, as a warning to everyone who might try to enter. Worried by his brother's absence after 3 days, Ali Baba went to the cave. Once again, he opened it with the magic words "Open Sesame," and found his dead brother at the entrance, where the thieves had left him. He brought the body home, but as he discussed these tragic events with his wife, they realized they were in great danger. If it became known in the city that Cassim had been murdered by thieves, the 40 thieves would probably hear of it and discover who he was. This would put not only his widow, but also Ali Baba and his wife at risk. As Cassim's brother, Ali Baba had inherited the business and the house, and the charge of everyone in the household where he now lived. The thieves had left the body of Cassim inside the cave, and it had disappeared, indicating that at least someone else knew their secret. So they would probably eliminate everyone close to Cassim to make sure their secret stayed well kept. Cassim had to be buried under the pretense that he had died naturally, so there would be no suspicion on the family. The problem was that Cassim's body had been mutilated by the thieves, and no one would believe this to be a natural death. So Ali Baba went to find a girl, Morgiana, a servant from Cassim's household, who was known to be witty and resourceful. Maybe Morgiana could save the day. At least she could try. She accepted to help and organize the show. First, she went to an apothecary to purchase medicines and told him, out loud, that her master Cassim was gravely ill, so the rumor would spread. Then she found an old tailor, Baba Mustafa, whom she paid. She blindfolded him and led him to Cassim's house, so he wouldn't know in which house he was. Once arrived, she asked him to stitch Cassim's body as well as he could, to make the death look natural. Baba Mustafa was an expert at his trade, and he managed to repair the body well enough to make it look like the corpse of someone dead from natural causes. Thanks to Morgiana's subterfuge, Cassim could be buried the following day without anyone suspecting anything. The family's honor and also its safety had been preserved, or so it seemed. As these events were unfolding in the city, the 40 thieves had returned another time to their cave and discovered that Cassim's body had disappeared. This meant that someone else knew their secret indeed. They needed to find out who and silence this person forever. But when they scattered in town to look for information about the recent burial of someone killed violently, they couldn't find any recent occurrence. Until one of them came across Baba Mustafa, the tailor, who mentioned that he had recently sewn a corpse to make it look presentable. The thief immediately wanted to know in which house this had happened, but due to Morgiana's precautions, he was blindfolded when he went to the house. The tailor didn't know. So he was blindfolded again and asked to retrace his steps and find the house. Unfortunately for Ali Baba's family, he could do it. It was still daylight, and the thieves could not act yet. So the thief who was with the tailor marked the door of the house with a white cross in a circle. Thanks to this symbol, he would return at night with his 39 accomplices, and they would kill everyone in the house. Was everything lost? Not quite, because Morgiana, the astute servant, had seen the thief and the tailor, and how the door of the house had been marked. So when the night fell, she quickly went out and marked all houses in the neighborhood with the same symbol. When the 40 thieves arrived later that night, they couldn't identify the house since they were all marked. In a furious rage, the leader of the 40 thieves killed the thief that had marked the house and promised he would be back. So the next day, another thief went to find Baba Mustafa, blindfolded him, and asked him to once again retrace his steps. And so it was done. Except, this time, the thief didn't mark the house with a symbol. Instead, he chipped a chunk out of the stone step at the entrance. But again, Morgiana was watching. She foiled the plan by making the same chip on all other doorsteps in the neighborhood. And when the now 39 thieves returned at night, they were once again unable to locate the house. The second thief was killed for his failure, and the chief of the remaining 38 thieves decided to do things by himself. The following day, he went to Baba Mustafa and retraced the steps with the old tailor blindfolded. But this time, he memorized every detail he could of the exterior of the house, so that no one would be able to trap him again. The thieves' leader supposed that the house was now aware that they were watched, since someone had reproduced the symbols and the chips. So he came up with a plan to infiltrate the house with his group. He pretended to be an oil merchant in need of Ali Baba's hospitality, bringing with him mules loaded with 38 large and sealed oil jars. One was filled with oil, and he opened it to show the inside to convince Ali Baba that he was a harmless merchant. But in the 37 other jars were the 37 other thieves. The plan was to wait for everyone to be asleep in the house at night. They would come out of their jars and no one would be left alive. Again, Morgiana saved the day. Whereas Ali Baba and his wife went to sleep, unaware of the great danger they were in, she opened successively the 37 sealed jars that had been unloaded from the mules, and in each one she poured boiling oil, killing the 37 thieves in their sleep. When the leader, who had been offered a bedroom, went to wake his troops, he found all the jars opened, and in each one a dead thief. The 40 thieves were no more, and only their chief remained, consumed by his desire for revenge. The next morning, Morgiana told Ali Baba about the events of the night, and showed him the 37 dead thieves that they spent the day burying discreetly. They had seen that the leader had disappeared and was not around them. But what could be feared of a now lonely man? Days, weeks, and soon months passed, during which the last thief planned his revenge, cautiously and patiently. He changed the cut of his beard to not be recognized, and established himself as a merchant. He befriended Ali Baba's son, who had also become a merchant, having taken charge of Qasim's business. One day, the opportunity he had been waiting for arrived. He was invited to dinner at Ali Baba's house by Ali Baba's son. As soon as he arrived, though, Morgiana recognized him and made her own plan to eliminate the last of the 40 thieves. She used to perform a dance with daggers to entertain the guests when there were dinners at the house, and this time she chose a particularly sharp blade. During her dance that night, she took the opportunity to come close to the thief as he was off guard, and at the moment he least expected, she plunged the dagger into his heart. Ali Baba was first hungry and mortified. Killing one of your guests was one of the worst possible crimes. But when Morgiana explained who she had killed and why, he was relieved, and so happy of her service and sense of initiative that he offered his son to marry her. With the death of the last thief, all threat had disappeared, and Ali Baba would now be able to live carefree, as he did before this day when he had discovered the cave in the forest. And now that the 40 thieves were all dead, he was the only one left to know about the cave, the magic rock that blocked the entrance, the magic words, and the fabulous treasure the cave contained. I told you at the beginning that apart from very well-known tales, there were many lesser-known stories in Arabian Nights, in 1001 Nights. Before we discuss the historical origin of the work, here is another story, less famous than Ali Baba or Aladdin. It is called The Merchant and the Genie, and it is an example of stories within a story. You will understand what it means. The story goes like this. Once upon a time, there was a very rich merchant who lived in a city, and he had a happy life. He had a loving family he was always happy to come back to when he returned from his journeys. He had everything he needed because his business prospered, and he liked his work, which made him travel to visit other kingdoms and make new contacts. Once on such a travel, he crossed the desert to reach a far-off town, and on the way, he felt very tired. Luckily, he saw the green of an oasis nearby, in the middle of a sea of yellow sand, and he went to the oasis. The place was pleasant. There was a pond of fresh water, and palm trees offering welcoming shade. So he washed his face, drank some water, and sat down to rest at the foot of a palm tree. To pass time, he started throwing stones here and there, and finally got up and went to the pond again to wash his hands. But just then, he saw a large and ferocious genie running to him. The genie looked angry and held a shining sword as he approached with a roar. "Merchant," he said, "you are going to be dead soon. I'll kill you as you dared to kill my son." The merchant did not understand. He had killed no one. But the genie explained that when he threw the stones, one of them hit his son's head, and he was killed instantly. The merchant said how sorry he was, that he meant no harm, and begged the genie to be merciful. But the genie was not in the mood to hear his pleas. He pulled the man to the ground and lifted his sword to strike him. In a breath, the merchant begged the genie to fulfill his last wish before killing him. Genies were compelled to grant that kind of wishes, so he stopped just before striking and asked the merchant what his last wish would be. The merchant asked for the right to return to the city for the last time, so that before dying, he would be able to meet his family one last time, arrange some money for them, clear his debts, and give some more money to the poor so that he would get a place in heaven after his death. The genie observed that this was a lot to ask for, and asked how long he would need for all that. 1 year, the merchant said, and he swore he would be back to the oasis in exactly 12 months to be killed. Not 1 day before, and not 1 day after. The genie grew thoughtful, but accepted, not before threatening the merchant that if he was not back in precisely 1 year, in precisely 12 months, he would find him and make him die even a crueler death than the one he had set for him. The merchant bowed in agreement, and returned to the city as fast as he could to tell his family of what had happened and that his days were numbered. They all wept and decided to make the most of the year they had left together. As he had promised, the merchant made a will, repaid his debts, and gave food, clothes, and money to the poor. He spent as much time as possible with his family, and they were happy despite the dark cloud over their head that grew bigger and bigger as days, weeks, and months passed. Soon enough, the 12 months were over. He said goodbye to his wife and children, and with tears in his eyes, he proceeded towards the desert and the oasis where he would meet his fate. When he reached the oasis, the genie had not arrived yet, so he sat down and began to wait. But as he was waiting, an old man approached and asked him what he was doing here, and if he was not afraid of the genie who lived in this oasis. The merchant replied that he already knew there was a genie, and that was the reason he was here, and he proceeded to tell everything that had happened to him. The old man felt sad for him, but was curious to see the genie, so he asked if he could wait with him, and the merchant said yes. The two started waiting, but before the genie arrived, a second old man approached and asked the same things as the first. They told him everything, and the second old man stayed with them to wait. And then came a third old man. The same things happened, so that when suddenly the genie appeared in a cloud of smoke, there were 4 waiting for him. The genie was even angrier than a year before. He had spent 12 months ruminating his revenge and was eager to kill the merchant. He went to the poor man and threw him to the ground as the 3 old men were shaking with fear. But as the genie was about to strike, the first of the old men found the strength to get up and asked the genie to hear his plea. The genie stopped and asked what he wanted. The old man said that he had a story to tell, and if the genie found the story more wonderful and exciting than the story of this poor merchant, the genie would have to spare 1/3 of the merchant's life. The genie was curious and liked stories, so he agreed to this, and he let go of the merchant for now. He said, "Tell your story, old man." And the old man told his story, a long and convoluted story about how his wife became a Hind, a story which lasted for more than 1 hour and captivated the 4 members of his audience. This story, the story of the old man and the Hind, was longer than the story of the merchant and the genie, and was so good that when the old man finished, the genie had to accept to spare 1/3 of the life the merchant had left. But as he was saying this, the second old man also came forward and offered to tell his story against another 1/3 of the merchant's life. And he did, and the story, the tale of the old man and the dog, was also very captivating, and after him, the third old man made the same offer. After hours and hours of storytelling in the oasis, of stories told by old men within the story of the merchant, which itself was told by Scheherazade to Shahryar within the story of 1001 Nights, the life of the merchant was spared, and the genie abandoned the project of avenging his son's death. These stories saved the merchant's life, and also saved Scheherazade's life for several consecutive nights. In a minute, I will tell you each of the 7 voyages of Sinbad the Sailor. But before, where do all these different tales come from? 1001 Nights was built over many centuries by various authors, translators, and scholars who compiled folk tales and traditions from several regions of the world: the Middle East and Central Asia, India, North Africa. The first compilations, that can be considered ancestors of 1001 Night, because there were several and sometimes they overlapped, they included similar stories. These first compilations were published during the Middle Ages in Arabic and Farsi. Published meant at the time copied manually. The frame story with Scheherazade was taken from a pre-existing antique Persian work called Hezar Afsan, 1,000 Tales, which itself was inspired by Indian and Persian tales. Then this was enriched with many more tales as the work traveled across the Islamic world, with stories from Mesopotamia, Central Asia, Syria, Egypt, and for centuries it was very well known and popular across the Islamic world. The tales were not just for children, they were for adults too, and they included erotic passages, or sometimes rather violent details, that you would not expect to find in tales for kids. Actually, modern adaptations of these stories tend to tone down the murders or immoral actions of some characters, because these adaptations are aimed at kids. The original tales were sometimes for all audiences or only teenagers and adults. Typically, we know 1001 Nights in the West under the angle of exotic fairy tales with magic, genies, and a happy end. But some of the stories were very different in style and tone. Some of them border on crime novels, for example. There is one that starts with the discovery of a chest that contains the various body parts of a woman, and it is an investigation to find who and why she was murdered. Others are more philosophical and can be read on different levels. Some stories are set in real historical locations, whereas others are in an unspecified fantasy world. The compilation includes poems. It is written in prose and verses sometimes. So as you see, it is a much broader work than the Western perception that tends to see 1001 Nights as exotic fairy tales for kids. The Western interest in it began in the early 18th century. It is already old, when a French author who had traveled to the Levant, to Syria, an Ottoman province at the time, translated and published his own compilation in French, and it was quickly translated to English with the Arabian Nights title. This compilation draws heavily on the historical compilations in Arabic and Farsi. The majority of the tales are taken from them. But the French guy also included two very popular stories from Syria that were not part of 1001 Nights until then. Ali Baba, that I told you before, and arguably the most famous of them all nowadays, Aladdin and the Magic Lamp, that we will conclude our night with. Now the story of Sinbad that we are going to relive is a part of 1001 Nights that is set during the Abbasid period in Mesopotamia, specifically the 8th and 9th centuries AD. It forms a cycle with 7 voyages, and Sinbad the sailor is the main protagonist, the hero. This cycle appeared later than most other tales in 1001 Nights, around the 18th century. It is not exactly known where it came from the Middle East for sure, but maybe the different voyages have much older roots in previous periods. Anyway, here is the story of Sinbad. Like for other tales, there is a story within the story. And it begins like this. Once upon a time, there was a poor porter called Sinbad. A porter, someone who carried goods around for other people. And the poor Sinbad lived in the city of Baghdad. One day he paused to rest on a bench outside the gate of a rich merchant's house. Sinbad complained about the injustice of the world. Why did he have to work all day and carry heavy loads just to survive as a poor man, while the rich lived in ease? The owner of the house, a rich merchant also called Sinbad, heard him and sent a servant for the porter. The rich Sinbad told the poor Sinbad that he was not always rich. He became wealthy in the course of 7 wondrous voyages, and asked the poor Sinbad if he wanted to know what had happened. The porter accepted, and Sinbad began with his first voyage. Sinbad was born rich, and his father left him wealth. But he was a lazy and dissipated young man, so he lost all of the wealth. Left with nothing, he decided to go to sea to repair his fortune. Once at sea, he set ashore on what appeared to be an island. But when the sailors lighted a fire on the island began to move and shake. In fact, it was no island, but rather the back of a gigantic sleeping whale, on which trees had taken root, and the fire had awakened the animal. The whale dived into the depth, and Sinbad found himself floating in a chaos of trees, whirlpools, and other sailors trying to swim. Some could return to their ship, and the ship departed, leaving Sinbad alone in the middle of the sea, clinging to a floating tree. Days passed, and he thought his last hour would soon arrive. But he was washed ashore on another island, a real one this time, and this island was covered in a thick forest. Sinbad began to explore it and came across a man, a servant of the island's king. The servant was desperate because one of the king's mares that he had under his watch was about to drown. It had followed a magical horse that lived underwater and would not accept to come back to the land. Alone, the servant could not drag the mare to the shore, but with the help of Sinbad, they managed to save it, and so the servant invited Sinbad to return to the king's court with him. There, he befriended the king, and could even retrieve the goods he had lost when his ship had sailed away without him, because the ship had docked at the same island. He offered his goods to the king as a sign of appreciation for inviting him to stay when he had nothing, and in return, the king offered him sumptuous presents. Sinbad could return to Baghdad on his ship, where he sold the king's presents for a great profit. With this new fortune, he resumed a life of ease and pleasure. After a while, though, Sinbad grew restless of this life. He had tasted adventure. He had been marveled by the vastness and the richness of the world, and now he wanted more. So he set to sea again for a second voyage. Again he was accidentally abandoned on an island, and on the island lived rocks, giant birds of prey, enormous animals, bigger than a house, that preyed on elephants like a falcon preys on a mouse. The rocks laid eggs taller than a man, and these birds were so big that a man was not even a prey they were interested in. Left with no way of leaving the island, Sinbad thought of a possibility. He waited for a rock to return to its nest, and attached himself to its leg with the help of his turban. The next day, the rock took off, and Sinbad with it. The sailor was transported back to the continent, to a remote valley where the rocks fed. The floor of the valley was carpeted with diamonds that made it shine wonderfully. But the valley was deadly. It was populated by giant snakes, so big that they could swallow elephants. Rocks were attracted to the valley because they fed on these snakes and on the elephants. But no man could survive more than a few minutes down this valley. So Sinbad abandoned his rock on a high point near the valley, and there he met with merchants who were in the business of collecting the diamonds. Except no one could go down and survive in this hell. So what they did was throw huge chunks of tender meat into the valley. The rocks liked this meat to feed their youngs, so they carried it back to their nests, but with diamonds stuck in the tender meat. The merchants waited for the rock to be gone again to get back the diamonds. This made Sinbad think of a plan. He strapped one of the pieces of meat to his back and went down into the valley with a large empty sack. He began to collect diamonds, choosing the biggest and the most beautiful ones, trying to avoid the serpents for a few minutes until a rock would spot him and the meat he carried on his back. Finally, a rock picked him and carried him to its nest, with a now full sack of diamonds in his hand. Sinbad escaped the nest with his treasure and could return to Baghdad with a fortune in diamonds. And this is how his second voyage ended. On his third voyage, Sinbad and his companions were cast up on an island where they had to escape a terrifying man-eating giant with a single eye that they blinded with the iron spit the monster used to roast sailors unfortunate enough to end on his island. And they escaped by the sea, under the rocks thrown at them by the giant's mate. This was directly inspired by an episode of the Odyssey, in which Ulysses lives a similar adventure. On his fourth voyage, he ended up shipwrecked, as usual, on an island populated by naked savages. The savages were apparently peaceful, and they offered a plant as food to shipwrecked crews, an herb that robbed them of their reason, after which they proceeded to fatten them, because they were cannibals. Sinbad realized what was happening and escaped thanks to a party of pepper gatherers that had made a stop on the island. They took him to their own island, where he befriended the king and amazed him with the stories of his previous adventures. The king gave him a beautiful wife, and life went on for weeks, easy and pleasant, until Sinbad learned of a peculiar custom of this land. On the death of a spouse, the other was buried alive with the corpse of their marriage partner. Both were dressed with their finest clothes and most precious jewels, and thrown into a communal tomb, a cavern, with only a jug of water and a bit of bread for the survivor to last a few days. Unfortunately for Sinbad, soon after he had learned of this absurd custom, his wife fell ill, and despite all his care, she died. Sinbad was quickly seized by the citizens and thrown into the pit with his dead wife. In this dark cave, Sinbad managed to survive for weeks. There were regularly new couples thrown into it, and generally the surviving partner wanted to die quickly, so he could take their water and their bread. And he also collected the magnificent jewels that had accumulated for generations. But how could he escape? He saw that wild animals sometimes visited the cavern, which meant there had to be an exit somewhere. And so he had the idea to follow them, which is how he found a small and narrow passage at one end of the cavern that led him outside to a cliff with a beach below it. There he waited a few days more, living on his stock of bread and water, until a ship that passed by took him on board, and he could return to Baghdad, wealthier than ever. But the call of adventure was stronger than the pleasurable life he had in the city, and once again Sinbad set sails for a fifth voyage. On this voyage, while passing a desert island, his crew spotted a gigantic egg, which Sinbad recognized. This was a rock egg. One of these enormous birds of prey he had encountered on his previous journey to the Diamond Valley. Foolishly, the crew disembarked to go see the egg, and they accidentally broke it, finishing having the chick inside as a meal. Sinbad ordered everyone to re-embark as fast as possible, so they would leave the island. But it was not fast enough, and already too late. The parent rock had returned as they were setting sails, and it soon caught up with the ship that, in its fury, it attacked by dropping giant boulders on it. The ship sank, and all sailors disappeared with it, except Sinbad, who survived, hanging to a piece of wood. He was shipwrecked again. This time, he ended up on an island, where he was enslaved by a malevolent supernatural creature, the Old Man of the Sea, who sat on Sinbad's shoulders and twisted his legs around Sinbad's neck. The old man would not let him go, and forced the sailor to carry him wherever he wanted, day and night, until Sinbad would die and he would find someone else to ride. Eventually, Sinbad, who was losing his strength every day, managed to get rid of the Old Man of the Sea by making wine and offering him some. The old man became drunk, fell, and Sinbad killed him, after which he could return to Baghdad. On his sixth voyage, Sinbad's ship was dashed to pieces on cliffs, and his companions died of starvation, until only he was left. On a raft that he managed to build, he discovered a river running out of a cavern beneath the cliffs, and on his raft he fell asleep out of exhaustion. When he woke up, he was in the faraway land of Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and there he was introduced to the king and told him wonders about his adventures and the great Abbasid Caliph, Harun al-Rashid, after which he was sent back to Baghdad with magnificent presents, including a cup carved from a single enormous ruby. For his seventh and last voyage, an aging Sinbad arrived on a desolate shore, floated down a nearby river to a great city, where he lived for some time and found a wife, the daughter of the chief of the local merchants. But the inhabitants of this city had a particularity. Once a month, they transformed into birds for a day, before returning to their human form. Sinbad had explored many lands and seas, but never the sky. So he asked several of them, when they were in their bird form, to carry him up high in the sky, to the uppermost reaches of the sky, where heaven began. Once flying there, he could hear the angels glorifying God. But the arrogance of a man trying to approach the heavens without invitation could not stay unpunished. Balls of fire began to fall from heaven on the poor birdmen. Most died, and Sinbad narrowly escaped death, landing on a mountain top. There, he decided that this had been enough, and he returned to the city, sold all his possessions, and went back to Baghdad with his wife, where at last he resolved to live quietly in the enjoyment of his wealth and to seek no more adventures. Peaceful years passed, until one day he heard Sinbad the poor porter complaining about the injustice of the world near the door of his house. He invited him and retold the porter all the adventures he had lived. This would not be complete without the story of Aladdin, probably the best known of all the stories associated with 1001 Nights, even though, as I told you earlier, this tale was not included before the 18th century. It is still an old Middle Eastern story, but it was added in Western editions. And it goes like this. Once upon a time, there was a poor young man, an adolescent, called Aladdin, who was taken under the wing of a powerful sorcerer. The sorcerer pretended he wanted to set him up as a merchant, but his real motive was to persuade Aladdin to retrieve a powerful artifact for him, a wonderful oil lamp kept in a magic cave filled with traps. The sorcerer could not go take the lamp for himself because he was not agile enough, and so he planned to use Aladdin to take all the risks for him. But he never told him what the lamp could do, out of fear that the young man would keep it for himself. One day, the two went to the cave, and the sorcerer gave Aladdin a ring, which he said would protect him, with instructions to go down a pit where he would find the entrance of the cave. He was to take the lamp, an ordinary-looking oil lamp, and nothing else, and bring it back to his protector. Aladdin accepted and went down. He found a cave where fabulous treasures were piled up, and on a pedestal the oil lamp. He detected and avoided the traps that protected the lamp and returned to the pit. The sorcerer asked him to give him the lamp first, after which he promised he would help Aladdin climb up to return to the surface. But this was a weird demand, and Aladdin asked to keep the lamp until he reached the surface, because the sorcerer's behavior looked ambiguous, and he didn't trust him. They argued, and it escalated to the point that Aladdin refused to go out with the lamp. The sorcerer thought he would just wait for the young man to die down the pit, and now that the traps had been deactivated, he would send someone else to retrieve the precious lamp a few days later, and so he abandoned Aladdin to his fate. The young man spent hours and hours in the cave, desperate as he understood that no one would come for him, until he rubbed his hands in despair. And when he rubbed the ring given by the sorcerer, a genie suddenly appeared. The ring was magical and could release a benevolent genie when it was rubbed, a genie that would serve the ring's bearer. The genie had powers, and Aladdin asked him to release him from the cave and to bring him back home. And so it was done. Aladdin returned to his mother while in possession of the lamp that the sorcerer wanted so much. They were poor and had now lost their protector. So his mother had nothing to buy supper, except this lamp that she could sell. So she began to clean the lamp. But as soon as she rubbed it, a cloud of smoke escaped the lamp, and when the smoke dissipated, a second genie had appeared. This one was incredibly powerful, and had been bound to the lamp since immemorial times. He told them that he had to serve the person holding the lamp, and this is how Aladdin became the owner of one of the most precious magic artifacts in the world, one that could accomplish all his wishes. From this moment on, his life changed completely. With the aid of the genie of the lamp, Aladdin became rich and powerful. He even married the Sultan's young and charming daughter, and following their marriage, the genie of the lamp built for him and his bride a wonderful palace, even more magnificent than the Sultan's. But such a twist of fate and the rise of a poor young boy did not go unnoticed. The sorcerer heard of Aladdin's good fortune and understood that it could only come from the lamp that he wanted for himself. Somehow Aladdin had escaped the cave and discovered the power of the lamp. So the sorcerer waited for Aladdin to be out of his palace and asked to be received by his wife, the princess, posing as a merchant who exchanged old lamps for new ones. He managed to trick her because she didn't know the secret of the lamp. She was happy to offer the old lamp that her husband had for a new, more beautiful one. And she also thought that the merchant's business was really not to his advantage. Of course, as soon as he held the lamp, the sorcerer became the new master of the genie, and he ordered the genie to take the palace with all it contained and transport it where he lived, while obviously keeping the lamp that would now allow him to satisfy all his wishes. When Aladdin realized everything had gone, the palace, but more importantly the lamp and the genie, he was devastated. What he had left was only his wife, the princess, and the genie of the ring, far less powerful than the genie of the lamp. But he summoned the genie of the ring to see what could be done. This genie could not undo any of the magic of the genie of the lamp, but he could still transport them to their former palace. There, Aladdin and the princess managed to trump the guards and the sorcerer and recover the lamp, after which Aladdin ordered the genie to return the palace to its proper place, and they could resume their happy life that culminated when Aladdin succeeded to the throne of his father-in-law, the Sultan. He had now ascended from the lowest to the highest position, thanks to his two genies, his wife, and his own determination. We have reached the end of our stories for tonight, and I hope you liked this journey. You can now close your eyes and let go, or pick another story from my library. I'll be back soon with a new one. And in the meantime, sleep well. Sweet dreams.